What if the most consequential military decision of World War II was never made on a battlefield, but in a quiet room far from the guns, where one man's judgment about character, loyalty, and control changed the course of history forever? What if the general who was supposed to lead the Allied armies into the heart of Nazi Germany was passed over? Not because he lacked brilliance but because his brilliance was precisely the problem. George S. Patton was the most feared American commander in the entire war. German generals studied him. Soldiers worshipped him. And yet, on the eve of the greatest military campaign in human history, Harry S. Truman and the men around him chose someone else. They chose Omar Bradley, a quiet man from Missouri, steady and unassuming, the kind of soldier who never made headlines but never made catastrophic mistakes either. That decision, made in the shadow of politics, personality, and raw power, reshuffled the entire command structure of the Allied forces and sent shockwaves through the war that are still debated by historians today. The story of why Truman backed Bradley over Patton is not just military history. It is a story about what kind of power America wanted to project onto the world, and what kind of man it trusted to hold that power. If this question already has you thinking, then you are exactly where this story wants you. Please subscribe to this channel right now, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who loves real history, because what comes next is the kind of story that changes how you see the entire war. And when you finish watching, drop a comment below telling us what surprised you most. Your voice matters here, and this community grows because of people like you. To understand why Truman chose Bradley, you must first understand the world as it looked in the spring of 1945, when Germany was crumbling but had not yet fallen, and when the decisions being made in Washington and London were less about winning the war and more about controlling what came after it. Roosevelt was dead. He had died on April 12, 1945, in Warm Springs, Georgia, leaving a vice president who had been kept almost entirely outside the inner circle of wartime planning. Harry Truman inherited not just a war but a command structure built by other men, with personalities and rivalries already embedded deep into its architecture. Dwight Eisenhower was supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Under him, two men represented the sharpest possible contrast in military personality: Omar Nelson Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, and George Smith Patton, Jr., commanding the 3rd Army. Both were Eisenhower's subordinates. Both had proven themselves in blood and fire across North Africa, Sicily, France, and into Germany itself. But they were not equals in temperament, and temperament, in the end, was everything. George Patton was a force of nature wrapped in a uniform. Born on November 11, 1885 in San Gabriel, California, he had spent his entire life preparing for war the way a painter prepares for a masterpiece. Obsessively, dramatically, with a conviction that he was born for exactly this moment. He had studied military history with the intensity of a scholar and fought with the ferocity of a warrior. By the time the Second World War reached its most critical phase, Patton's 3rd Army had liberated more territory, captured more prisoners, and advanced faster than any comparable force in the entire conflict. Between August 1944 and the end of the war, his men moved across France and into Germany with a speed that left even his own supply lines struggling to keep up. He crossed the Rhine. He relieved Bastogne. He moved with a boldness that made German commanders shake their heads in disbelief. And yet, and this is the heart of everything, Patton was also a man who could not stop himself from being Patton, even when being Patton was politically catastrophic. The slapping incidents of August 1943 in Sicily were not forgotten. On August 3rd and again on August 10th of that year, Patton had struck enlisted soldiers suffering from what we now understand as combat trauma, calling them cowards in front of their fellow troops. The scandal nearly ended his career. Eisenhower reprimanded him privately but kept him, because Patton was simply too valuable to discard in the middle of a war. Then came October 1944, when Patton made a speech at the opening of a welcome club in Knutsford, England, suggesting that after the war, the world would be run by Britain and America, omitting the Soviet Union entirely. The political firestorm that followed was immediate and severe. At a moment when Allied unity with Moscow was considered essential, Patton had casually insulted one of the most powerful nations on earth. He apologized. Eisenhower raged. Washington watched. And the pattern became impossible to ignore. Patton was a weapon that sometimes turned in the hand of the man holding it. Omar Bradley was everything Patton was not in terms of public behavior. Born on February 12, 1893 in Clark, Missouri, Bradley had risen through the ranks with a reputation built on competence, calm, and an extraordinary ability to earn the trust of the men under his command. War correspondents called him the soldier's general. He did not wear pearl-handled revolvers. He did not give speeches about blood and glory. He listened. He planned. he executed. During the Normandy campaign, it was Bradley who commanded the American ground forces on D-Day, June 6, 1944, overseeing the landings at Utah and Omaha beaches. The catastrophic losses at Omaha, where men died by the hundreds in the first hours, were partly the result of decisions made under impossible conditions, and Bradley carried that weight without flinching. He did not collapse under pressure. He adapted and he prevailed. By the time the war in Europe was approaching its final act, Bradley had command of over 1.3 million men, the largest American field army ever assembled under a single commander. The formal elevation of Bradley over Patton in the post-war command hierarchy came through a combination of events, political pressures, and deliberate choices made at the highest levels of American government. On September 20, 1945, Omar Bradley was appointed head of the Veterans Administration by President Truman, a role of enormous national importance at a moment when millions of soldiers were returning home in need of medical care, housing support, and reintegration services. This was not a consolation prize. It was a statement of institutional trust. Truman had seen how Bradley operated, methodically, humanely, without ego getting in the way of mission. Then, in 1948, Truman appointed Bradley as Army Chief of Staff, and in 1949, when the position of Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was created under the newly unified Defense Department, Bradley was chosen as the first man to hold that title. He became a five-star general of the Army, the highest rank in the American military. Patton, by contrast, had died on December 21, 1945, in Heidelberg, Germany, from injuries sustained in a car accident on December 9 of that year, before any of the post-war appointments were finalized. We have now arrived at the exact midpoint of this story, and if you have been watching this far, you already understand that what is unfolding here is not just a tale of two generals but a portrait of power itself. Please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel if you have not already, like this video, and share it with someone who loves history and leadership. Leave a comment below about something in this story that caught you off guard, whether it was a date, a decision, or a detail you had never heard before. Your engagement keeps stories like this alive, and there are dozens more waiting for you here. The question history keeps asking is this: what would have happened if Patton had lived? The accident that killed him was, by every account, entirely random. On the morning of December 9, 1945, Patton was traveling in a military car near Mannheim, Germany, on his way to a pheasant hunt. A United States Army truck made an unexpected turn, and the collision occurred at low speed, yet Patton was thrown forward and broke his neck. He was paralyzed from the shoulders down and never recovered. He died 12 days later. Had he lived, would Truman have placed him in any significant post-war role? Most historians say the answer is almost certainly no. The political liabilities were simply too great. Patton had already been relieved of command of the Third Army on October 22, 1945, after making incendiary public remarks comparing Nazis to ordinary political party members in a way that caused international outrage. Eisenhower had removed him, gently, with a transfer rather than a dismissal, but the message was unambiguous. Patton's era was over. Bradley's era, however, was just beginning. As the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he oversaw the military response to the communist invasion of South Korea, which began on June 25, 1950. It was Bradley who advised Truman on the decision to intervene, helping to shape a military strategy that would define American foreign policy for the entire Cold War era. It was also Bradley who, in October 1950, publicly opposed General Douglas MacArthur's push to expand the Korean conflict into a direct confrontation with China, a position he defended with his famous remark that such a war would be the wrong war, in the wrong place at the wrong time against the wrong enemy. That statement, measured and precise, encapsulated everything Bradley represented: strategic clarity over theatrical ambition. He was not interested in glory. He was interested in outcome. The contrast between Patton and Bradley was not simply a matter of style. It was a fundamental disagreement about what war was for and what a military leader owed to the civilians above him in the chain of command. Patton believed, genuinely, deeply, almost mystically, that he was destined for greatness, that history had placed him on the earth to fight and win great battles, and that the politicians and bureaucrats who questioned him simply did not understand what was at stake. Bradley believed that the soldier's highest obligation was to the mission and to the democratic structure that defined American power. He never confused his personal ambitions with national interests. And in a world being rebuilt after the most destructive conflict in human history, that distinction was everything. Truman, a man who had grown up in a hardscrabble Missouri town and believed deeply in the accountability of those who held power, understood exactly what Bradley represented. The legacy of that choice echoes forward through decades of American military history. Every chairman of the Joint Chiefs who followed Bradley inherited a role that Bradley had defined, one of institutional integrity, political awareness, and measured counsel to civilian authority. The model he established influenced figures like General Matthew Ridgway, General Maxwell Taylor, and eventually Colin Powell, each of whom navigated the relationship between military command and civilian governance in ways that bore the unmistakable imprint of Bradley's philosophy. Patton, for all his genius, had never mastered that relationship. He had never fully accepted that in a democracy, the general serves the nation, not the other way around. And when the war ended and the battlefield disappeared, that failure of political understanding was precisely what made him impossible to place in the architecture of the new world being constructed. History does not always reward the most brilliant or the most courageous. Sometimes it rewards the man who understands the moment, who grasps not just what needs to be done on the ground but what kind of power the nation is prepared to trust, sustain, and defend in peacetime. Harry Truman chose Omar Bradley because Bradley understood that the war was not the point. The point was what came after the war, the institutions, the alliances, the structure of authority that would keep the peace in a nuclear age. Patton understood battle. Bradley understood history. And on that difference, the entire balance of command shifted, quietly, deliberately, and with consequences that shaped the American military for generations. This is the story that deserves to be told again and again, not just as military history but as a lesson in the kind of leadership that truly endures. If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you did not know before, please subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. A student, a history lover, a leader searching for perspective. And leave a comment below. What was the moment in this story that hit you hardest? Was it Patton's fall, Bradley's rise, or the quiet decision of a president who knew exactly what kind of general the new world needed?